Dashboard warning lights. There's nothing worse than driving your car and seeing one of the warning lights suddenly flash on. Obviously, the big one is the check engine light. That's never a good sign. When that one lights up, you can't just turn up the radio and hope it goes away. Speaking from personal experience that involved a 1985 Ford Bronco 2. But warning lights serve an important purpose. They caution us that if we don't address a certain mechanical issue, the consequences will inevitably be both dire and expensive. The good news is that if we heed the warnings and take care of the issue at hand, we'll be able to keep on trucking, at least until the next warning light appears. But paying attention to the warning lights keeps us moving forward and on the right track. In the so-called Sermon on the Plain that we hear this morning, Jesus flashes some warning lights for our spiritual lives. He holds up a series of blessings and woes to the crowd that has gathered. And what becomes immediately clear is that left to our own devices, we have the potential to veer off the road, to lose sight of that which matters most. By the way, the Sermon on the Plain is similar to the better-known Sermon on the Mount, but there are a few important differences. They both begin with the traditional form of the Beatitude. You know this. Blessed is the fill in the blank. But let's be honest, Luke's Sermon on the Plain just doesn't get the same publicity as Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is basically Jesus' version of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Nobody wants to talk about King's other speeches, and nobody wants to talk about Jesus' other sermons. But I think people focus on the Sermon on the Mount because, well, for several reasons. It's much longer, it's more poetic, perhaps, and maybe also because mountains are just so lofty and plains are just so plain. Still, there's a common message Jesus is sharing in both these sermons. Both highlight the upside-down nature of God's kingdom, where the poor, the meek, and the persecuted are blessed. Both focus on how God values compassion, mercy, and justice over worldly power and wealth. Both flip the comfort of the status quo to hold out a vision of grace, love, and the inherent dignity of every human being. To hold those values is to follow Jesus. The biggest difference between these two sermons, of course, is the topography. The Sermon on the Mount takes place on a mountain. Jesus evokes Moses handing down the 10 Commandments from atop Mount Sinai, as he offers the traditional and familiar Beatitudes. Blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek, and so forth. Jesus' words are written on the human heart rather than on stone tablets, but they are equally central to our faith. The Sermon on the Plain, or literally the Sermon on the Level Place, was delivered after Jesus spent the night praying up on a mountaintop with the 12 apostles. We hear that he then came down from the mountain and preached to a great crowd. And the location matters here. Jesus came down to meet the people where they were, both literally and metaphorically. What's interesting is that this phrase, level place, in Scripture often refers to places of suffering and hunger and mourning. It is the place, this level place, where you find corpses, or people making idols, or those in distress. And we're reminded that Jesus isn't above death and sin and destruction. He wades right into these level places, bringing healing and hope and forgiveness. To me, this is what makes the Sermon on the Plain so powerful, even before any words are even uttered. The fact that Jesus not only doesn't avoid the level places, he actively seeks them out as places to offer words of comfort and hope. The thing is, Jesus isn't some remote deity who stays above the fray at a safe distance. He very intentionally enters right into the messiness of our lives. And that is exceedingly good news. Because Jesus is at hand. Jesus is with us. Jesus is intimately involved in our daily lives, in our joys, in our struggles, in heartbreak and celebration. Jesus comes down to meet us where we are. But back to the warning lights. While we naturally want to focus on the blessings, Jesus also offers a series of woes to those who are rich, full, and laughing. In other words, he's speaking directly to the privileged among us, which, by almost any measure, includes nearly everyone sitting here this morning. Now, you should know that a woe does not equate to a curse. Jesus is not cursing those with means, those who aren't worried about where their next meal is coming from, those who have a roof over their heads, those who can afford to get their cars fixed when the check engine light comes on. Woe, loosely translated, means look out. It is not a curse or a condemnation, but a warning. A recognition that, spiritually speaking, the haves often struggle to stay on the right path. Why? Because we tend to put our trust in all those things that Jesus warns us about. We prioritize possessions and pleasure and play. Again, not bad things, unless we find ourselves putting our trust in the idol of material things rather than the God who is the giver of all things. What Jesus is telling us, and in Luke's gospel, these are the very first words he utters after choosing the 12 apostles, which means it's really important. What Jesus is saying right out of the gate is that the goal of the life of faith is not to be successful and rich and happy all the time. Rather, genuine fulfillment comes when we acknowledge our profound need for God, when we recognize that we are utterly dependent upon God for all that we are and all that we do and all that we have. When you acknowledge that truth, when you allow it to penetrate the thick armor of your heart, that's where you find peace. That's where you find that deep, abiding joy that only comes through faith in Jesus Christ. And when we fail to acknowledge that we are small and utterly dependent upon God, when we put our faith in our own talents and abilities and resources, when we begin to replace God with things we can buy, that's when the warning light goes on, which leaves us with a choice. Ignore it and continue on with the comfort of the status quo, or reorient our lives by putting ourselves, our souls, our bodies into God's loving hands. As followers of Jesus, we are invited to live a life of beatitude, a life of blessing. And Jesus is pretty clear that blessings begin by honoring those who dwell in the level place. Sometimes that's us. And always that is those who exist on the margins of society. The poor and downtrodden, the voiceless, the persecuted, the least, the lost, and the lonely among us. When we heed the warning lights, it allows us to see more clearly the way of Jesus and to act in accordance with his will. That's where fulfillment comes in. That's where meaning is derived. That's where the spiritual rubber meets the road. And that's what allows us to continue on in this journey of life and faith.